Hey, what's up guys, I'm Josh. So, I've noticed that there are two types of audiophiles. There are those who are seeking basically a sound of something that they've heard before, whether it's a concert that they went to one time, a live performance that they saw, even the sound of their own instruments, maybe a system that they previously had. Then there is type 2, like me, which has this kind of theoretical version of a sound that we haven't quite heard yet, but we think is possible. And for one reason or another, it's solidified in my brain as being kind of the achievable goal for sound, what I would like to find in a given system. And I think the Diana TC has been the closest to what I've imagined this to be. So not only does this headphone perform very well technically, but also very much aligns with what I prefer personally. So in this review, I'm going to tell you why I think the Abyss Diana TC is the best headphone currently and is going to be the headphone to beat for the next decade. Some quick disclosures. Abyss did send this out for a review. They are not paying, asking, or otherwise trying to influence my review in any way. All thoughts and opinions, as always, are my own. And no, DMS is not off camera holding a gun. I'm totally kidding, by the way. Completely, I swear. Now, the build, similar to other Dianas I've reviewed, is top-notch. These, I think, have the highest machining quality and tolerance quality of any headphones on the market right now. They've updated the angle of the driver from the previous generation and added some thicker, more comfortable pads to adjust for the new angle. The pad quality has also gotten better than it already was. These changes are subtle, but they do end up resulting in a pretty big difference. There's also these two little comfort pads on the inside, which again makes this even more comfortable. Now, one might ask, why is this specifically the best headphone? What makes this the best? What feature would make this the best? Why is it deserving of being the best? And while individual components of it are very, very good, I do think that when you get into the upper realms of capability of these headphones, what makes things really stand out is how cohesive all those individual parts are when they come together. And that's where I think this thing really shines. I think it's the cohesion of the build quality and the sound quality all coming together to make just a very, very good headphone. Now, when it comes to sound, I think we all have things that make us fall in love with certain headphones. For some headphones, it's the treble. For some, it's the bass. For some, it's the mid-range. If I recall back to my personal experience, the first headphone that I truly fell in love with was the HD 600. And the reason why I fell in love with it was the mid-range response. It was just so well isolated, and it positioned the vocalist in a way that I'd never heard from any other headphone and is still rarely achieved from headphones. Now, for the Diana TC, I think that the most addicting sound on this entire headphone is coming from the treble response. It is just the perfect amount of speed, timbre, and sparkle. So speed. This driver is fast, but how fast is it, you might be asking? Well, I'll show you how fast. You want to see it again? I'm just kidding. So I'll lay out the speed difference like this. The speed difference between a pair of AirPods and an HD 800S, I feel like is the same speed difference between that 800S and the Diana TC. It's ludicrously fast. Elon Musk would be proud. Now, raw speed alone isn't really enough to impress me. I think what's really genuinely impressive here is that it's not overly bright. You get this incredible speed, but this absolute sense of total control. And for treble response, I think the tuning process that Abyss had to go through to get this correct must have been brutal, but the results show. Now for timbre, I'm gonna talk a lot about timbre in this review. This headphone has amazing timbre flexibility, probably the widest timbre flexibility of any headphone that I've ever heard. And it seems to specialize in strings, especially metallics, but it is colorfully textured and nuanced with every other sound that I even question if it has a speciality. Now, I've made a point to listen to Chris Jones's Long After You're Gone, to the point of which that I basically don't like that song anymore. But it's a good reference point just because so many people have heard it on so many different systems, and I can kind of draw a point of comparison. I've listened to it on basically every headphone for the past few years. This headphone is the best headphone interpretation I have heard of that song, specifically how well the guitar plays. It is just magnificently crisp and detailed, and you get this nice tonal resonance from the guitar. It sounds lovely. And this easily is the best representation of guitar speed, sparkle, and raw color that I've gotten from a song, outside of very, very high-end speakers. Now, the sparkle of this definitely falls within that realm of being not overly sharp, but still colorful, lively, and definitely kind of pops up and kind of shimmers at you in a very lovely way. Now, mid-range has some very impressive focus and forwardness over the rest of the sound. It's got this awesome and awe-inspiring authority to it, despite not going about it in a traditional sense. Now, let me explain this. When a headphone is good at mid-range, it's typically good because it isolates other areas of the frequency response. Let me give you an example. The new LCD5 has really, really good mid-range, but it's a little lighter on bass and it's a little lighter on treble, especially in dynamics. So it kind of pushes this mid-range forward at you. It's very good for mid-range. This doesn't quite go about mid-range in that more traditional sense. This, despite not boosting the mid-range, seems to be able to just create a position and a focus for the voice that I think is very, very impressive. And there's really only one headphone that this really reminds me of, and it's going to be what this is based off of, the AB1266, also from Abyss. Now, I would like to call out one of only two areas where I have suggestions for improvement of the sound on this. The lower mid-range, I think there's a total argument to say that it is not forward enough. Sometimes you lack this little bit of guts in the lower vocalists. Now, they're always clear, they're always distinct, they're always very vivid, but they're not always as forward as I would like and not always as powerful as I would like them to sound. Now, the voicing and the vocal image itself is very, very clear, and the whole picture is there. You get all the information. But on thinner recorded vocalists, you can get a sound that I do think is a little bit thin, and a slight boost in the lower mid-range I think would help fill out those thinner vocalists while not muddying or kind of over-bloating those already filled out lower vocalists. I think just a bit more in that area would be ideal. Though as it stands, to call it anything besides just absolutely impressive would be disingenuous, I think. So vocal timbre. I think this is actually an area where I have a little bit of a blind spot actually with this headphone. I have a very difficult time breaking down the actual characteristics for vocal timbre of this headphone. This and the HE1 might have the most kind of step out of the way version for vocals, where it doesn't really sound like you're listening to the headphone. It really just sounds like you're listening to whatever the music happens to be playing. So if you get a perfectly natural, real sounding recording, it will sound natural and real. If you get something that sounds artificial and a little bit chambered, you might get that through here also. But there doesn't seem to be a carried over characteristic of the headphone itself. Let me give you another example here. The 1266, while fantastic for vocals, compared to this, I feel like has a little bit of almost like a metallic twang to it. And it seemed to have that characteristic that carried over from song to song to song, where I always knew that I was listening to the vocals of a 1266. This seems to not have that characteristic, or I'm not able to hear that characteristic, and it really just seems to be doing whatever the music is able to display. So again, if it's good, it's good. If it's not so great, you're gonna get kind of a bad result out of it, but that's not a fault of the headphones. I'm totally willing to admit that this absolutely could be a limitation of my ability as a listener. This also may be one of those things where I won't know what the characteristics are until I actually get a different headphone in here that can enlighten me as to what this headphone is already doing. So bass overall is very good, as you would expect for the price. It's clean, rich, sonically unobtrusive to the other regions of sound, and it is completely absent of any bass bleed. Both sub-bass and mid-bass are cleaner and deeper and stronger and thumpier, more impactful, all those fun ways of saying that, than both the Phi and the V2 of the Diana series. It's for bass definitely the best Diana. I do think that the 1266 in a head-to-head contest does perform bass a little bit better, even though both are pretty equivalent. This might have a little bit better speed, but I think the 1266 has a higher quantity, and it's got a more unique bass feel to it because the 1266 has more of a bass shelf. I'm not going to go into what that is for time's sake, but the bass sounds, I think, a little bit more unique on that headphone. It kind of represents the sound of a room a little bit better than the Diana does. But in terms of the rest of the sonic characteristics, I feel like the TC is definitely above the 1266 in almost every other category. Now, oddly enough, I think the bass response most reminds me of a very crazy headphone, the HE1. I think those have very comparable bass. While they are not the deepest of any headphone, they have one, ridiculous speed and texture to them, but two, they also have this characteristic of hitting quite dynamically in the initial kind of very first impact of a bass note, and then they kind of settle into a deeper rumble later down the road. So it's almost like they have higher dynamics on the initial impact, and then they kind of just settle into their textured quality later. It's one of the few headphones that I feel happy with the bass quality, even though it's not super, super crazy, overly deep, like something like an Empyrean or an LCD4. Now, imaging is among the best I have ever heard. I think we're getting to a point where imaging isn't really getting any better for the top playing headphones. I don't feel like things are getting that much more precise. However, this does have an X factor of timbre. Now, the timbre here is so good that you're almost able to isolate sounds just based off the timbre. They don't even have to have really good positioning. In fact, you can have a pretty broad space for all the instruments, and yet you still get this layering solely based off the timbre. So with the timbre, with the imaging capability, with the soundstage, everything that you listen to just feels like it's got this crazy solidified specific position in space and time. And then it's just so quick and so all over the place with all the different imaging placements of different sounds if you have the right recording. It's a really visceral experience. Now, this leads me into probably the second area for improvement for this headphone, the sound staging. The sound staging is not bad. In fact, it's pretty good, but it's definitely not the widest sound staging headphone that are out there today. And there are definitely headphones like the 1266, like the Aria, like the 800S that are wider. This headphone is wider than the V2 and the Phi, which I had the same complaints for those, but it's perfectly happy to be played within a head-based experience. It's not really trying to throw things way out in the distance. It's very much a personal listening device, and that's what you get with this headphone. Okay, so let's talk about some competition. Immediately my brain goes to the HE1000 SE from Headphone. That's an extraordinarily detailed headphone as well. I do think that this headphone is more detailed, but less focused on the top end. That headphone has some great properties to it. Like I said, it's got a lot of detail, but it also has some negative characteristics. It is a little bit bright in the upper mid-range and the upper treble response. Now, you get a lot of information because of that, but the listening experience I feel like is less enjoyable. This in comparison feels more refined and just plainly better tuned than that headphone does. And I think that the treble response specifically is a lot more enjoyable on this headphone, let alone the mid-range and the bass, which I think are also better. Now, the Susvara. If you were to compare the Susvara and the AB1266, I would say that the 1266 sounds better, but the Susvara has way better comfort, and that I think would play into the decision of somebody who listens for a long period of time, often with their headphones. But the Dynamic C is a comfortable headphone with a better sound quality than the 1266, and that takes everything, I think, away from the Susvara. I think, simply put, especially because it's actually cheaper, even though they're both extraordinarily expensive, the TC is clearly the superior headphone between those two. Then you have perhaps the most apt comparison, which is the new Odyssey LCD5. The LCD5 has incredible dynamics for its mid-range response, like I discussed, but it's also a little light on the bass response and a little bit dark in the treble response relative to its mid-range performance. I do think the mid-range response on that headphone is a little bit better than the TC, mostly because it is more filled out in that lower mid-range, and you feel like vocals have a little bit more focus to them, and I definitely think there's an audience of people who would prefer the vocal performance on that headphone. However, treble quality, bass quality, and sound staging quality I think are superior on the TC. That's not even getting into the build, which is clearly better on the TC. Okay, so some additional notes on the sound of this headphone. This is not going to be the headphone that is going to take every possible sound from every album, any point in time, and make it sound delicious. That's not really what this headphone is going to be. This headphone has the highest ceiling for sound quality that I've ever heard on any headphone, regardless of price. However, it requires a good track to get there. It will have the best sound quality, providing that you have some of the best recordings. Then there's kind of the bulk of music that most people listen to, which are not super high fidelity and not super low fidelity. I think most people occupy this space. That music sounds ridiculous on this headphone. Just know that like on your average top 100 type music, any limitations you really hear in terms of quality is probably coming from the recording, not the headphone in those circumstances. Then you have things that are just recorded poorly. This is a lot of older music that wasn't recorded to a super high standard, wasn't mastered to a super high standard. Unfortunately, because this headphone is so honest, some of those songs can come across kind of crap. You're gonna know that they're not good recordings. This is not a knock on the headphone, but it is a reality of listening to music on this headphone. The last note is on amplification. This requires a ton of amplification. It's not quite as much power requirement as something like a Susvara. However, it is more revealing than most other headphones that I've heard. And if you are gonna put a soft or a bright or a sharp or a glary amplifier on this headphone, you will know immediately. This makes amp hopping back and forth very fun. I've been using the XI Audio Broadway, which I've been using to analyze this, which is a new to me amplifier, but I also cross-reference with something that is very familiar, my topping A90. So if you're gonna purchase this, if you don't already have a good amplifier, expect to maybe invest in one to get the most out of this headphone. I recommend something super clean. I think for the money, that A90 is fantastic. Okay, so conclusion. I think that this is the most complete picture headphone that I've come across. This is not only probably the best overall sounding headphone that I've come across with only a couple, and I literally mean a couple minor areas for improvement, but it also has comfort, insane build quality, in my opinion, pretty cool looks, and is lightweight. And so it's like kind of hard to start asking for areas for improvement. So that's it. That is why I think the Diana TC is currently the headphone to beat and is currently the best headphone on the planet. All right, thanks a lot for watching. Until the next video, my name's Josh, signing off.